Welcome to chapter 3 of Wuthering Heights. It actually feels weird to be reading it in summer because this is such a fall winter kind of read because the atmosphere in this book feels so much more fall winter. There's a brief moment where it feels like spring, but that is a key element of Gothic stories is the atmosphere, that they are crucial to the story. They are a character within themselves, which segues me to the opening line of chapter 3. Lockwood says, while leading the way upstairs, she, speaking of Catherine, recommended that I should hide the candle and not make a noise, for her master had an odd notion about the chamber she would put me in. And what's going to happen in this chapter is that he's going to be confronted with Catherine's ghost. Now, this is Emily Bronte's interpretation of Gothics, a Victorian interpretation of Gothics. Now, Gothics were hugely popular in the late 1700s. Jane Austen was a fan of them herself. She even mentioned Anne Radcliffe's Mystery of Udolpho in her story Northanger Abbey, having her characters reading that book is very popular, and there are a ton of other Gothics that came out at the time. And the big thing about Gothics is this like heightening of emotion. This is something that's trying to put your readers purposely on edge. But the other thing about the Mystery of Udolpho is that a lot of the things that scared the readers and the main character, often causing the main character to faint, were ended up being revealed to be benign. It was everyday. It was not actually that scary thing. And Emily Bronte does something similar here. But instead of it being objects or things, it's people. And we see it with Lockwood. Lockwood is us. He is our guide. He is our Virgil. And he's walking in as a skeptic. One could say he's not expecting to see ghosts, and he's also not expecting the worst. We actually are seeing him trying to view these people that he's meeting in Wuthering Heights in a better light than they actually are. But the ghost to Kathy almost is a more digestible thing for him than to confront the truth of this house, which is it's a toxic house with toxic people within it. Because for him, then it kind of takes the rose colored glasses off from his life. And this is a very common occurrence in many horror stories you're going to find throughout history and throughout today, where we use ghosts, monsters, and haunted houses to represent toxic homes and toxic people. And you're going to see a couple other Gothic and scary stories coming out in the Victorian times that lean into this, where they're leaning more into the people are the terrible things. They are the secret things behind it, using them as allegories. And I think like often like this is the first time I'm actually paying more attention to Lockwood than I've had in the past. I focused on the characters in the stories, but Lockwood is fascinating because I'm realizing he's us, that we're viewing the world in a much better light than him, and often we want to ignore what is in front of us, which is another thing that Emily Bronte's younger sister Anne Bronte did in the Tenants of Wildfell, yes, Wildfell Hall, where she's talking about domestic abuse, and she at least says it up front for the most part, whereas Emily is putting like coloring it as an allegory here, but it's pretty apparent if you look. One of the reasons why I recommend and encourage rereading books, especially your favorite books, is that you're going to see things that you didn't see before or learn things. For instance, when you get to the end, when you get to Catherine's story, you forget the details in the beginning of this. And in the beginning of this, for example, in this chapter, we're learning that she says that, she doesn't know the answer. She's only lived there a year or two. And it feels like it should have been so much more time between where we left Catherine in the end compared to where we're meeting her in the beginning here. It feels like so much more time should have happened for her to then become this callous and jaded, because when we meet her later in the story, she is so bright and full of life. And look what has happened just existing in this house for 1 year or two. And also, she doesn't know how many years that she's been imprisoned here. That the years, the days have blurred, that she doesn't know how long she's existed here, but it's affected her that fast and that violently. I'm still on the opening paragraph, but in this, like the opening paragraph, she has, Catherine saying that you should hide the candle, that there had so many queer going on. She should could not begin to be curious. And Lockwood, thinking too stupefied to be curious myself, I fastened my door and glanced around for a bed. All this is to let the readers know, hey, this is a Gothic. It's Emily Bronte telling the readers, like, hey, this is what the genre is. Because with genres, usually there are certain key aspects that need to kind of occur to let you know, hey, this is this genre. For example, in romances, it should have a meet cute and a happily ever after to be considered a romance. You can do whatever you want with all of it and all the things in between, but it should have kind of those 2 points. Similar with Gothics, kind of usually you have the atmospheric, but usually there's something paranormal to it, but it doesn't have to be throughout the story. For example, here, the ghost doesn't pop in and out. Kathy does haunt the narrator throughout the story herself, but she's a living being most of the story. It's only once that we encounter with the ghost. And even the house, it's there, it's haunting. Like, it's there, it has a presence, it's a character itself, but it's not as active a character as, say, Bly Manor and The Haunting of Bly Manor and like Mike Flanagan's story, or even like any of the Mike Flanagan. What's the first one called? Haunting of Hill House. Like, that house is, even in Shirley Jackson's version of Hill House, the house itself is like living, breathing character doing active things. So it's fascinating that Emily Bronte is a Gothic, and it does count as a Gothic, but it's not heavy. She doesn't lean that much. The heaviest aspect of the Gothic that she leans on in the story is the atmosphere. Lockwood discovers in this room that there's kind of this like little window seat that closes. It becomes a little closet. And as we'll learn a little bit later in this book, this is where Kathy and Heathcliff used to hide and talk and play. This was their secret hiding space. This was their safe space, but it was never safe entirely. The world still existed outside of it, and people could still come to find them there. They weren't entirely removed from the rest of the world. And that's the same with Lockwood. Lockwood literally says that he pulled the doors together again and felt secure against the vigilance of Heathcliff and everyone else, but that quickly will be ruined with the ghost of Kathy coming to the window. So it's showing, in my opinion, that there is no corner of this house where anyone is truly safe from the toxic occupants of it. In the little closet room, Lockwood discovers a pile of old mildewed books with writing on some of them, and a lot of it is like writing over and over and big and small, where it says Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Linton, and Catherine Heathcliff. Now, I want to focus more so on Catherine Heathcliff because Heathcliff is called Heathcliff. We never learn any other name because he doesn't have any other name. Whether Heathcliff is a first name or a last name, most likely first name, because he doesn't have a last name, meaning he doesn't have a family, meaning he doesn't have a heritage. And that is a big aspect of the story we're already seeing with this ancestral home that's Earnshaw's. It's supposed to go to young Harrington because it's his ancestral home. What's in a family name? Like, yes, you might get history and you might inherit like a house, for instance, but you're also inheriting maybe trauma and all of these other bad things. Can you be broken off from the family? Can you break away from that? There's so many things that you can unpack here, but Catherine putting as one of the options for her future Catherine Heathcliff is fascinating to me because, one, it's a very childish thing of like, well, he doesn't have a last name, but I guess that would be my last name if I were to marry him. But also it could represent that if she had married him, they would have formed their own family, their own future, they would have created their own history, their own path, their own legacy from there. They'd be starting from scratch. And what that could have meant if Caffrey had done that versus joining marrying Linton with history and ancestral home and all these kind of things to it. So one was a much safer route than the other, which I love that. Like, I'll dig into this later, but obviously, but I just love that, like, despite everything going on, despite the heightened emotions of the story, you still have with Kathy her doing what everyone else had to do at that time of what is the safer path for me, especially someone of her class. I love when Lockwood looks at the books and he finds one is the Testament, and written on every free space of the book is just Kathy's handwriting or drawing in caricatures of Joseph, who we're later learn is very much about the scripture. So she's doing what she's supposed to be doing, which is supposed to be reading the scripture, but kind of not at the same time. She's doing her own thing, which I think is a perfect representation of Kathy as a person. Kathy, by appearance, makes sure at one point that she looks like a lady and marries like a lady is expected to do, what is expected of her class. But she doesn't live by it. She doesn't act by it. She can't fit within those conformities. And so I think it's a very interesting representation of a person like that, that there are people who are supposed to be expected to live a certain way, but their personalities just, they can't fit within those molds, so they write all over the margins. So Lockwood is reading what it's pretty much Kathy's diary that she wrote in the margins of her book or Bible. And from it, we learn that this was a very religious household, more so after the father had passed. And Hindley, the brother who came into becoming the master of the house, let Joseph influence, and Joseph, the servant, is very religious, forcing them, the rest of the household, to sit for a 3-hour service on Sundays, things like that. And also, we're seeing that, like Kathy saying, on Sunday evenings we used to be permitted to play if we did not make much noise. Now a mere titter is sufficient to send us into corners. You forget you have a master here, says the tyrant, speaking of Hindley. I'll demolish the first who puts me out of temper. I insist on perfect sobriety and silence. And it's showing us little glimpses of what's to come. And having read this book a handful of times, I know a little bit more details of what's to come. And so what I gather from this is that the father seemed more open-minded. He traveled a lot. He's the one that brought Heathcliff back and brought him into a home, that supposed gypsy. He seems kinder in that sense. But Hindley immediately hated him. And so it's showing that prejudices and biases doesn't have to be generational. It can just randomly start with one person. And Hindley is a fascinating character because he is kind of the starting point of the downfall of this family. He is the toxic one. He is the drunk. He is the one that is so focused on himself. And the part of the reason why he hates Heathcliff is that he seems like he got his father's love, and Hindley thinks that he deserves it just because it's his birthright. But also, Hindley being here and not doing anything is fascinating, because for me, I think that Hindley shows signs that he wants power and influence, especially as Kathy calls him a tyrant. But the reason why he's not out in the world in, say, like London society, except for maybe a brief stint to gain his wife, is because he would be lowly there. He is just a random landowner from the north. He doesn't have power, influence, or title, whereas here in this small neighborhood up north, he does have power and influence, and he uses it. I think because he was ignored by his father was constantly gone when he was a child. He is desperate for some meaning in life, and for him, he's putting it on here. And like Kathy's upbringing, there was no one there to guide her. She was left to run wild. And then one day Hindley says, you're supposed to be acting like a lady, but no one showed her the way. And yes, she would always have been strong-willed and probably would have bucked back, but it would have been different. And Hindley is the initial start of this toxic household, which affected Heathcliff and Kathy's upbringing and actions. And we have to remember they're also still very young during the pinnacle of the events here. And so you could argue that Kathy and Heathcliff's future and actions is through nurture, that they were nurtured because they weren't nurtured by Hindley and others. They were left to their own devices and things. They weren't shown a better way. And yeah, so pretty much this, what I want to get at is that pretty much the scene is like to whet not only our own appetites of showing us glimpses of what's to come, but also Lockwood, which this would lead him to then asking Nellie the story of Wuthering Heights. And this is also the starting point of the downfall of Wuthering Heights. It's kind of like the fall of the House of Usher. The style that Joseph's dialogue is written is not the first time you're going to see it in literature, nor the last time, but usually it brings about a lot of controversy. A little less here than, say, like Gone with the Wind, where we see it, but it's such a weird thing where, like, I understand a lot of the arguments where, like, for instance, here, a part of me wants to skip what he says because it's a little harder to read because it's not properly written. But at the same time, it does add a lot of character. You can hear the accent, you can hear what it would sound like and what he would be like. And so at the same time as making fun of him for his ignorance and poverty, kind of, while he has a strong hand influence on Kathy and Heathcliff's upbringing, he is technically lesser than them and can't even speak properly compared to the two of them. And there's a lot, like, so Emily Bronte choosing to do this with mostly just Joseph's character is, I think, trying to say something to the readers and present a side of this interesting conflict we have going on here. I don't know exactly what. I think I can pick it apart a little bit where like I think it's just to show like the class differences and who has power, that sometimes it doesn't even need to be class to have power over someone and influence. That Joseph himself also is a toxic element. He brings on the religious element, but they should have been able to rebel against him because they are his betters, but they don't, which is fascinating also. So like there's a lot you can unpack here with that. But again, there is a lot of controversy more so with other books like Gone with the Wind, where it's the slaves in the books speak more like this, and there's a controversy around that. But I will admit, I did want to skim over this. It is a hard thing to read. It slows you down. Going back into the nurture element, we're seeing it here with her saying that she picked up the book and threw it and vowing I hated a good book. Heathcliff kicked his to the same place. And then there was a hubbub. And it's showing that their upbringing and their later actions was nurtured that way. It's because of Joseph's style of their upbringing, of Hindley's style of their upbringing. That's where it started going downhill once their parents had passed. That led them to making choices that they did. Of course, they wouldn't want to educate themselves better because it was thrust upon them so violently. They weren't encouraged. And it's because of the violence physically used against them that they rebelled in other ways and got closer. Like, it's when two abused kids kind of become closer because they're in a similar situation together. That is what's happening with Kathy and Heathcliff. That's why they're so fused, because they went through such horrible trials during their childhood, but they were in it together. They're in the trenches together. And we also have to remember with this is fascinating because this is going to be the only time we directly hear from Kathy in her views and her opinions. And she is very biased because Kathy seems like a very kind of biased person, but she is also a child while she's writing this and being punished. But the rest of the story, even though Kathy has dialogue, we have to remember Nellie is telling us the story, and Nellie is going to have her own biases. And even then, Lockwood could be altering it, because who knows that Lockwood isn't taking on the style of writing that's popular at the time of having him be our narrator. He's writing down the story being told to him by Nellie, which Nellie is just retelling something. So it's kind of, whispered down the lane. So things are going to be altered depending on each person's views and what they want to see within these characters, as we're already seeing with Lockwood wanting to see the good in people. As Lockwood continues to read drowsily, his eyes shift from manuscript to print, aka Kathy's little handwritten notes, to the actual text of the book. And remember, this is a biblical book. And so he reads the line 70 times 7 in the verse of the 71st. And I know the basics of religion. I'm not very well versed. I had to Google it myself, because there's a point that she is putting this in here. Like, she took the time and kept it here. There's a reason. And the reason is that this text is about forgiveness. It's about how forgiveness should not be counted or bound. It should be boundless. It should be unlimited. You should be willing to forgive, which this is a very subtle way of Emily Bronte stating one of the themes of the story, because one of the themes is revenge. And what correlates with, or coincides more so with, revenge is forgiveness, the willingness to forgive, which is what Heathcliff does not do. He is not willing to forgive and move on and be the better person. He digs his heels and brings everyone down with him. That is the problem. And in the end, the happy ending is because those who have been affected, such as not Hindley, Hadley? What is, oh god, I always forget his name. I think it is Hindley. I think the son is Hindley too. There's a lot of H's in this book, and I've read it a million times, and I still get confused. But the son that Heathcliff is abusing now does not bring everyone else down to his level too, just as Heathcliff did. He is a mirror to Heathcliff, or a foil more so to Heathcliff. They have similar enough circumstances, and Hindley actually has more of a reason to be proud, but doesn't. He is kind, he is forgivable, he wants to just make a better life and be happy with Kathy, or Catherine more so, the younger. And that is the theme of the story. While the revenge is what captures our attention, it is the lesson we need to learn, is that you're happier when you're willing to forgive and move on with your life. the son's name is Harrington, the father is Hindley. I'm reading about Hindley because we're reading Caffey's text. A lot of the names repeat and they're very confusing because you got Caffey, who is the focal point of the story, the love interest of Heathcliff. And her daughter's name is also Catherine or Caffey. So I like to differentiate by calling her Catherine. Then you have Hindley and you have Harrington and you have Heathcliff. It's Linton and all these names, and there's a lot of H's and a lot of C's, so they kind of get a little confusing. So that's why I keep trying to clarify and remember them myself too. So one of the things I do when I do this is if I fixate on a line, I'm gonna poke at it and prod at it and peel it apart. And I fixated when I was reading this. Lockwood saying, "Alas for the effects of bad tea and bad temper. What else could it be that made me pass such a terrible night?" And at first I'm like, oh, eye roll, but why? Why did it make my eye roll? Well, it's because I realized that he, like many other characters in this book, blame external things than internal. Lockwood put himself in this situation. He thrust his company upon these people who did not invite him. He forced himself into nature, not realizing the danger of it because he does not respect nature in that way, because he has not had a life where he had to respect nature in that way, but he's walking in thinking that man can control all, because man versus nature is a big element of the story too. But he thinks that it is the bad temper and the bad tea of the company that he is amongst affecting his night. Again, not realizing it is his own fault, but we also are looking at, is this nature versus nurture? Are all these people born to be malicious and evil, or is it the environment that they're in? Is he commenting that he's already feeling the effects of this environment, this toxic environment, affecting even his night's sleep? Is this his subtle way of saying that? So there's a lot of things that you poke at here. Can look at nature versus nurture. You can also look at kind of a selfishness of trying to blame everything else but yourself, your own actions for the circumstances you put yourself in. The thing about Wuthering Heights and the beauty of it is that you get so lost in the text that sometimes you forget it's being told to us. So Kathy and Heathcliff's love story is one aspect, obviously, but this is mostly about Wuthering Heights and the black hole it becomes, the toxicity, and how it sucks everyone into it. But that tale is being told by Nellie, who is then Nellie's tale is being told to the readers by Lockwood, and you can suppose also Lockwood's tale is being told to us by Emily Bronte. But one way you can imagine it, or the way I'm imagining it, this read through, is that Lockwood went here and experiences. Imagine an explorer, a gentleman explorer, going to the Amazon and sharing their tales, but putting a lot of biases and prejudices in their tales that they then publish to the rest of society, London society. There's going to be a lot of wrong stuff about it. Look at any of the tales coming back from gentlemen explorers from the Amazon, from Egypt. There's a lot of wrongness because you're going to see a lot of inherent biases and assumptions. And you see that here even with his dream sequence. And that's why I'm thinking that the dream, he could have had the dream, but most likely is a narrative device that he is using in his tale that he is publishing to London society. There are aspects from the writings that Kathy had in her book, who's to say that actually was in the book, Kathy's tales about supposedly going to church and all these things, or it could be used by Lockwood supporting this belief by like London society that those of the Moors, for instance, are closer to being heathens, closer to being animals. They're not quite civilized like them. And we keep seeing examples so far with Lockwood's interactions that support supposedly this. But his dream is him wandering the moors with Joseph as his guide, needing a staff to help him, and then a cudgel, a weapon. He's like, why do I need a weapon? And he says that he passed the church 2-3 times, but does not cross the threshold. And there's so many things you can talk about here. So one is him using this dream sequence as an allegory, again, to infer that those the Moors are heathens, that the church is right there. They're so close, but yet they do not cross the threshold. But the other aspect of this dream is man versus nature. Because he goes into saying, we came to the chapel. I passed it really in my walks twice or thrice. It lies in a hollow between two hills, an elevated hollow near a swamp whose beating moisture is said to answer all the purposes of embalming on the few corpses deposited there. That in nature it takes, it kills, because it's so dangerous, which is a common theme of man versus nature, which is that man is arrogant and thinking that they can command and control and own nature, but nature does win oftentimes in the end. And this theme also goes very much into the Romanticism era of writing, which Emily Bronte is fitting within. She would have been growing up reading a lot of it. And Romanticism era of writing is not romantic love in that sense. Romanticism era of writing is about feeling, about emotions, about like nature is a common allegory of it too, about how man cannot know all and cannot control all, is to juxtapose the Enlightenment era of thinking, which applied the scientific reasoning to everything. They thought that they could figure out and know everything and control everything. In the Romanticism era, coming out of a disillusionment of the revolutions such as the French Revolution, believe that that's not true and leaned more into more philosophical, loftier ideas of man and their nature, like, personalities, and how we can turn so bad so easily, like that, seeing what happened with the French Revolution, and also just emotions and things such as nature. Other members of the Romanticism era of writing would be like William Wordsworth. If you've seen anything with my Hunger Games content, or if you read Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the Ballad of Lucy Gray is a real ballad by William Wordsworth. And you see that the ballad ties a lot with nature and its commentary there. I'm rambling a lot with this section, but there's a lot to unpack with this section. There's probably more that I can't even think of or get into more details, like the bodies and things like that. I recommend you reading. My copy is page 29. Read this, pick it apart. I would love to hear what you think about this dream sequence. So Lockwood's dream sequence continues, and I honestly don't remember it, but it's probably because it doesn't seem like it applies to the rest of the narrative. We also have to remember during this time and even prior, stories were written to be slightly longer, but they were also broken up into volumes. So, for example, Pride and Prejudice was broken up into 2 volumes because one, it's easier to make with slightly less paper, but also you can make more money out of like having multiple volumes. And during the time that Emily Bronte is writing, you had also, for example, Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens would publish by chapter, and he would make more money by the word. So that's why like his books, for example, are super lengthy, and you have sometimes scenes that seem nonsensical. Same thing with Les Miserables. He was paid by like the page, the word, and that's why you have a whole thing about the Paris sewage system. So I'm not too surprised why you have this kind of lengthier dream sequence, which doesn't seem like it applies to the narrative, but it kind of does. It fits within the time of what was happening, but it does, technically. I think it's a way of her showing the theme in a different manner. And my interpretation of this, with the whole thing of like Lockwood falling asleep and trying to stay awake during this whole sermon, and then finally standing up and being like, no, he's the sinner of sin. We should turn on him. But then the minister, priest, whatever the man is, says, no, it's you. And the rest of the assembly turns and starts beating him up with clubs and weapons that they have. And it's a mob mentality. And I think from that, my interpretation is to show how easy someone in power can sway the mob and how hard it is when you're slightly lower. So, for example, how easy it is for society to decide someone like Heathcliff should be villainized based off his looks because he is described to be very gypsy like. And I'm using their word. They describe him as dark skinned gypsy. Or even Kathy for being not fitting into what their expectations are. The mob mentality going on and against her. And I think this is a awakening also for Lockwood because he is coming from someone with slightly more power than others. To be then thrust into, well, not thrust, he threw himself into this society, the Moors up northern, and it's a very different society, and he is the interloper now. And he feels like it's very easy for them to gang up on him. That being in this house with the other three, it feels like, or four, they feel like they ganged up on him. So I think that's what he's kind of manifesting in his dreams. But I think the theme that is kind of being stated as one of the many themes is how easy someone with power, and it could be as simple as a priest, can sway a mob and make a decision against someone that is wrongfully accused. Again, looking at Heathcliff and that whole situation there. Lockwood wakes up from his dream and remembers he's lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving in the snow. I heard also the fur burrow repeat its teasing sound. Now, remember, this is written during the Romanticism era, and as a reminder, not romantic love, but Romanticism as an era of like ideology. If you want to know more about this, I've done a couple videos. If you look at my Pride and Prejudice, the history that she wrote during, or Jane Austen wrote during, and also my video on Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes recently, I posted on my YT. I go into the Enlightenment and Romanticism era philosophy. I talk about them a lot there, but a component in Romanticism's literature is often nature, not always, but often, and there's symbolism behind it. And you see, even today in the Hunger Games, for example, a lot of symbolism behind her choice in food and nature. So I want to break down, I have my laptop this time to break down the symbolism of what the possible meanings of these free descriptions of nature that she chose to use, because she chose to use them. For example, the gusty wind often symbolizes turbulence, change, and the unpredictable nature of life, which that is what's happening not only in Lockwood. He is in this moment of change. He has taken himself out of his normal society, put him in this new society. It's going to change his views on the world and how he is as a man. He's going to grow from the foppish, boyish lover kind of person with rose-colored glasses to seeing the world in a very different light, almost realness to it. And that's also mirroring the type of writing that the free Bronte sisters were writing, which was very different from what was kind of happening prior. But also the unpredictable nature of life, again, also mirroring man versus nature, but it can be broken down to power and strength, the unpredictability, cleansing, renewal, emotional intensity, physical sensations, all these other things. Going on to the snow, it often represents purity, cleansing, and new beginnings. This is a new beginning for Lockwood, but also this is a new beginning for the members of Wuthering Heights that are currently residing there. The thing is that we don't realize this because we're then being told the narrative and brought back in time by Nell. So the predominant chunk of the book is back in time, but when we do catch back up where we are in the present time, there is a new beginning, a new change. There's a change in Heathcliff and the other members that bring on a better life. A purity is a purifying. So you could say that his Lockwood coming in helped kind of bring on this change, you can say. But right after, we're about to hit the scene where Kathy's ghost is going to be at the window coming in with the gusting wind and the snow. So it's Kathy's ghost is kind of the facilitator of this change. And the final one is the fur bow. I can't say it. It carries a rich tapestry symbolic meaning across various cultures and traditions. Is stemming from evergreen nature and association with cold weather environments, but in symbolism, it represents resilience and eternal life, like hope and renewal. It could also represent strength and steadfastness, which that can represent Kathy and Heathcliff's love, that they have the strength and steadfastness to them, and protection and healing qualities to it, warding off evil, which is interesting because of the curse that Heathcliff supposedly put on Kathy's soul, and that's why she's wandering it. So there's a lot to unpack with this. This is getting lengthy. This just this bit I'm talking about here, but I would love to know what you guys think about the symbolism. Obviously, with this book, I'm going to encourage and I'm going to do myself looking at obviously nature, because again, this is a time period where they're putting a lot of meaning behind these particular details and descriptions. There's going to be a lot that is inferring and saying between the lines. And in this instance, this is the pinnacle, not like pinnacle, but this is the changing point. This is the moment that's going to change the trajectory of Wuthering Heights to bring it out of its black hole. But we don't see it because a big chunk of the book goes back in time and shows us how we ended up in, or how Wuthering Heights became a black hole. The wording in this section is very interesting because he says that he notices what is the cause of this tapping sound and ascribes it to the right cause, but it annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it, if possible, and I thought I rose and endeavored to unhasp the casement. The hook was soldered into the staple, a circumstance observed by me when awake but forgotten. I must stop it, nevertheless, I muttered. knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm out to seize the impertinent branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of a nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling meanwhile to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied shiveringly. Why did I think Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for Linton. And the reason why the wording of this is absolutely fascinating to me is that it diminishes the actual violence and the actual, like, what is actually going on in the situation, is trying to justify or excuse what he had done with, for example, this noise had annoyed him so much that he couldn't open the window, and he said that he knocked his knuckles um through the glass. Knocked my knuckles sounds much more gentle than, punched through or thrust through or broke through, which is what he had actually done. Knocking makes it seem like he didn't even get through, but he obviously had gotten through because these ice cold, fist was caught in his hand of a ghost. And him then saying, why did I think of Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for Linton, is him kind of slowly saying to us, like, this is obviously a dream. Obviously, I'm imagining this. And what I really love about this moment, not only is that it's a perfect example of what is typically seen in Gothics and even horror books, where there is a point where these characters kind of break from their norm and becomes more aggressive, more of the worst of humanity. And so this scene is showing that anyone is capable of this level of violence, but then equally capable of trying to gaslight us into thinking it's not as violent as it actually is. And it fits within the Romanticism era. Again, I keep saying this, not romantic love, but romanticism is coming out of the period of the Enlightenment. It's in response to the Enlightenment, and it's in response to things such as the French Revolution and having seen the worst of humanity come out of the French Revolution. They saw terrible things that people had done to one another within a society. And so they're now this period of philosophy and writing and stuff is looking at humans, emotions, feelings, what we are at our core. And this is what this book is doing, that at our core we're all the same. We all have the capabilities of being this angry, being this violent, being this revengeful. It's just the layers of masks that we might put on over top of it, or what might push us towards it, or where we are in society kind of thing. Like, is it nature versus nurture? Those kind of arguments. There's a lot you can unpack here, but this one paragraph to me is absolutely fascinating because of the wording that he chooses to use here to diminish the actual violence of the act, and then also diminish the encounter. Like, he's telling us about the ghost, but equally trying to not admit that he had supposedly seen a ghost by saying, making it seem like he's still dreaming, but also like not wanting to sound crazy, like I saw a ghost, trying to make it seem like almost metaphor to the story that he might be writing to the public, if we're to believe this version where Lockwood is writing the story to us, if that makes sense. This is the fun part about literary analysis or analyzing or close reading your text, is that you can have a line like Kathy saying, I've come home, I got lost in the moors. This one little line can have a multitude of interpretations. For example, it could have a religious interpretation, which would make sense because Lockwood was just reading her Bible or religious text that she had written in, and his dream was very religious coded with the preacher and the assembly and all those kind of things. So this could be alluding to Kathy straying from the flock, straying from Christian values and sinning, and now wants to return, but she can't because she's dead. And the reason she is a ghost and has not moved on from this life is because she has left the Christian values. Another interpretation is that home represents society and the moors represent nature or the unknown, which could mean that, like, on one hand, she didn't want to fit into societal expectations and try to be different and now regrets it, which I kind of can, kind of can't see Emily Bronte commenting on. Like, I don't know too much about Emily Bronte. Like, I know a base level about her and the other sisters, but it could also be commenting that, like, she was being greedy, that Kathy had everything in her favor. She had succeeded. She had a husband that loved her, a good, wealthy home. Others would want that, but it wasn't good enough for her. She kept wanting more, and that was her downfall. Now, the third interpretation, though, is actually what first came to mind is that it reminded me of the poem Lucy Gray by William Wordsworth. Yes, that Lucy Gray, the character from Ballad Song vs. Snakes by Susan Collins, it was inspired by the poem by William Wordsworth, who is a figure in the Romanticism era too. And the reason why it reminded me is that in the poem, Lucy Gray is a child that leaves home to go fetch her mother, I believe, or father from town, gets lost in the wilderness in a snowstorm, and disappears supposedly, or is possibly dead, possibly a ghost. Her footprints just stop. And it's paralleling this because there's a line in the poem that talks about Moors, and there's the ghost aspect of it, like here. And I was doing an analysis of it. There's so many ways to interpret that poem, and I plan on making a video essay about it. I've been working on it for months. I'd like to go really into the poem and the connection to the book. But one of the things with the Moors, for example, is that there's a duality of meaning to it. It could be good and hopeful, but also equally bad and threatening. With nature and the Moors, it's both those things depending on how you see it, depending on the day. There's this risk, this danger with nature. And that is kind of what is continuously being used in the story with the Moors, this vast land separating Wuthering Heights, the house, from like the Linton house, from other homes, from the rest of society. There's this dangerous moors in between that can be good and hopeful in the daylight, but in the dark, it's dangerous and threatening. So that one line, there's so many ways you can interpret it. I love it. There's probably even more. I would love to hear what you guys think and how you guys interpret it. So following Kathy saying, I lost my way in the moors, Lockwood says, as it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window. And it's to remind us that Kathy was a child, technically, when she died, when she went through everything. She was 18, 20. I'll find out later in the book. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's been a handful of years since I last read this book, but she's very, very young. And you forget that because of her experiences, because we're not often reminded of her age, you forget how young she is, which her age is very important. And that's one of the reasons why, for me personally, I'm a little upset with the casting choices of the new adaptation coming out. Because while I like Margot Robbie, she's too old for the character, and movies are a visual media, and being able to see their youthfulness like helps the viewers, helps the readers to understand the choices that they made. That of course she'd be rash because her brain hasn't been fully developed, her frontal lobe isn't fully developed. She is very similar to Romeo and Juliet in that sense, her and Heathcliff, because they're still young too. They're making rash decisions based off emotions, which makes sense for that age. And it also adds this layer of sadness and trauma to it, that she was so young and all this had happened to her. She had died so young and yet is scorned too. So there's so many layers when it comes to her age. And that's why it's important to me, her age being reflected in the movie. Because, like, for example, the old version of Romeo and Juliet, those actors looked very young, and that helped a lot for viewers to then see how tragic the story was. And that's what we need for this too, because in the book, they often don't bring up the age. So in my mind, I often picture Kathy and Heathcliff older than they actually are. And when you stop and think about how old they really are, it makes a lot more sense, and it equally makes it a lot more tragic. One of the reasons why I love doing a close read or analysis of some of my favorite books lately is that I've been noticing details or questioning things that I never picked up on before. And for example, this scene here, when I imagine it exactly like the version of the movie with Ralph Fiennes. That's the version that I was first introduced to when I was in 5th grade, and my mom had called me down to watch her favorite book and movie, and that sparked my interest until I incessantly harassed her to let me read the book and started me on this journey of Wuthering Heights and classics. But I remember very briefly just his hand going through, but he didn't punch it the way through. The branch came through the window, and the interaction with the ghost was so brief. I don't remember it like this detail of him punching through the glass. And even though, as I said previously, he rewarded it to make it not seem like that, you notice the cruelty of him here more so in the scene when he said that terror made me cruel. And finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in," and maintained its tenacious gripe, almost maddening me with fear. And you're starting to see now him slipping and simultaneously justifying his cruelty. And he even admits that he was cruel, because how else do you describe him than using that action of rubbing her wrists upon a broken glass till it bloody, till fell till the blood rained down and soaked the bedclothes. It's probably his wrist that's bloody, but he was trying to get her to. If you're to believe that is a ghost, it could be a real woman. Who knows? Who knows what could be a lie here? But let's go with it being a ghost. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. It's still showing this level of violence that I don't remember because it wasn't in the movie. And that's what I remember. Again, this is why certain details in the movies are relevant. It's going to stick to your mind a little bit more than sometimes what you read in a book. And like, for example, that then showed Lockwood in a much kinder light than what is being shown in this book. Again, like I said earlier with the scene, this interaction with the ghost, this whole exchange is showing that any man has the capabilities of being cruel. Again, going into the Romanticism's belief that had been spurned out of the disillusionment of the Enlightenment, having seen the ability of cruelty from humanity after the French Revolution. So that is what it's showing, that despite his class, despite coming from the epitome of society, we're supposing Lockwood comes from London, he can equally be cruel, and one might blame the environment that he is in currently to lead to this cruelty. He probably would blame that, but it's anyone's capable of it. And another way you can view this is that Kathy is still a victim of this. Kathy is a victim to cruelty. She is equally a component to it. She is equally cruel to others, but was she nurtured to be cruel and relentless because of this wild, cold moors, one might argue? But another thing you could argue is her determination to be let in and him not letting her in could be argued that there might be someone, again, going the religious route, someone might be wanting to change, but others are still keeping them out because of the sins of their past. There's so many ways you can interpret this interaction. I think the other tragedy of this is that Kathy has been a ghost at least the same amount of time that she had been on the earth, if not a ghost longer than she had been on the earth. I cannot remember when she died, if she was 18, 20, around there, but she has been a ghost, as she admits it here, for 20 years. She has spent an equal amount of time haunting the moors as she had been alive upon the moors. And there's a sadness to that. And even her daughter will outlive her, but it's in part because her daughter has a better chance. There are people who want better, and she wants better. She has a better heart than Kathy did, but Kathy kind of wanted more, whereas Catherine just seeked to have family and seeked goodness. There was more goodness in her heart, if that makes sense. I'll analyze the two of them later in the book when we actually get to those moments, obviously, but it's a tragedy again. That's why the age thing is important to me, as I previously said, because the youthfulness of her makes it more of a tragic story. And because often she's not portrayed that way in movies, you forget it and you don't notice. It's not like Romeo and Juliet where it's, pounded into her head, their youthfulness, their child, they're 14. That makes it a tragedy. But this is equally tragic because she is equally young. There's obviously the whole discourse, not only on the internet, but across decades, if not centuries, of people being like, the currents were just blue. Don't overanalyze it. But I think overanalyzing sometimes can be more fun and more of what you could garner from the text. Because again, they're just words on a page. And the author might have intention, but the minute that these books come out into the world, they no longer belong to the author. They now belong to the readers and how they interpret with their own experiences or interpreting the author's experiences or anything like that. So the reason why I'm saying that is that I'm going to overanalyze this interaction between Lockwood and Heathcliff. When Lockwood screams and Heathcliff comes in, he stood near the entrance in his shirt and trousers with a candle dripping over his fingers, and his face is white as a wall behind him. First off, he doesn't notice the candle dripping on him, doesn't notice his pain, because you can interpret that he was so hopeful but equal parts afraid that that sound he had heard from his old room that he had shared with Kathy, their secret hiding place, was Kathy returned. Despite knowing that she is dead, he is that hopeful. But the other thing I want to focus on is that his face was white as the wall behind him. And this is why the race aspect of Heathcliff is very important, because in this interpretation I am going to take with this is that his face was white as a wall behind him. And the whole time that Lockwood has been interacting with him, he's been treating him almost like an equal, like he is a landowner, like he does have power, that he is like a white man. And even when he is angry, he is annoyed but dismisses. He allows it because he would allow another white man landowner to have these moments of aggression, to stand there with how do you describe it? Crushing his nails into his palm and grinding his teeth to subdue the maxillary convulsions. He doesn't see him as monstrous as one might have years ago when they saw him as a lowly gypsy boy, again using the book's own words. But because it seems like he is a landowner, comes across as white, dresses as it, and probably is passable at this point, Lockwood sees him as that, and it gives him a lot more excuses than he would have previously. But it is also a tragedy of this. Again, with the greed, just like with Kathy, Heathcliff wanted more in life, which is fine, but in the process, he harmed so many people to achieve this, because he also thought this was the way to have Kathy, that he needed to rise in order to have Kathy. So there's a whole knot here that I'll get into obviously later when we get to those moments. But what I want to get at is that Heathcliff, the tragedy of it is that he finally has reached a point where a stranger sees him as that position that he has worked and burned the earth for, and is passable and excused his horrible, nature, but yet he is miserable because the one person he was doing it for died because of his own actions. Another part of this book that I think is very big but a little subtle is the classism of it. Again, it's more obvious with Heathcliff when he was younger and how he is treated by others. And you can argue that also has to come down to race, but you see it also here with Lockwood, where when Heathcliff says, who showed you to this room? Who was it? I have a good mind to turn them out of this house the moment. And Lockwood readily says, it was your servant Zillah. I replied, flinging myself to the floor and rapidly resuming my garments. I should not care if you did, Heathcliff. She richly deserves it. This poor servant had showed him a room which he had annoyed someone for. He had crossed the moors in horrible weather because, again, the arrogance of man thinking that they can best nature. And the moment that it backfires on him, he has no problem throwing someone lower than him to the wolves, throwing her out into this elements. And I think it really shows this read through. In my opinion, Lockwood I always saw as like a neutral character. I really didn't acknowledge or thought much about him, but this time I'm noticing how there's a darkness to him, and I think that is the point. The point is to show again that anyone is capable of cruelty, that your station doesn't excuse you, but equally, even the lowest a person could be kind to. It's a thing where, like Lucy Gray said in Ballad of Songbird 6, it is our life's journey to stay on the right side of things. Anyone is capable of darkness. There's a quote towards the end of this chapter where Lockwood says a sensible man ought to find sufficient company in himself. And this line caught my attention. I actually tried to film a video yesterday, and I think my brain was just not working, and I loosely knew what I was trying to get at and why I couldn't get past this quote, because I knew there was some importance to it. And looking at it again today, I still couldn't quite find the word, so I decided to Google and see what others have said about it. And it captures, for the most part, my initial thoughts with the line itself, because it reflects a character's disillusionment with social interactions and an embrace of self-reliance. It suggests that a man having experienced the ups and downs of social life can find fulfillment and contentment with his own thoughts and beings. The quote spoken by Lockwood encapsulates a shift in perspective from seeking external validation and pleasure in society to finding it internally. It is a statement of self sufficiency and a recognition that the true contentment can be found within oneself rather than relying on external sources. And that's the sense that I got with that quote, but simultaneously, the reason why I got stuck was because it doesn't match Lockwood based off what we've seen of Lockwood. I don't think he's going to change that drastically from someone that is thrusting his society upon others, as we've been seeing these last couple of chapters, so social to then become so recluse, so hermit, so internal in his thoughts, because that is not the case as we see going forward. And even though we are not going to be with Lockwood for much longer, you could argue that this story is being written down by Lockwood and shared with the public. So you could argue that he is still very much involved in society and finds like external validation from it. Because even though he is not directly interacting, he is using these people and this story to then share with the public. So how internal? So I think Emily Bronte is kind of talking about that. Like, I think maybe, or at least the way I can interpret it is that you're never completely removed, you're never completely internal, because even in your internal, you are still thinking of others, people and society and stories, or making your own stories, because you could argue that most of this could be very biased. And the beauty of the story that I love most is that the story is predominantly told to us in the sense of actions and dialogue. We're not getting told the reasoning behind these characters' actions, because the story is being told by Nell, who wouldn't know Heathcliff and Kathy's motivations. She might guess, but she doesn't know. And same with everyone else. So it's up to us, the readers, to then form our own opinions. And as we see with even Lockwood, our own personal experiences will bias our interpretation of it. Look at the opening chapters of his interaction with Heathcliff. He is shaving down the rough edges of Heathcliff that we see through Nell's version of him, because Lockwood sees something in Heathcliff that he identifies with, or hopes to identify with. So of course he's going to shave down the rougher edges, because he doesn't want to see that ugliness in himself. So that, I think, is the beauty of the story, is that we were being shown so much and then left to the readers to interpret, which feels so realistic to real life. We don't know other people's internal monologues and things like that. But on top of that, going back to the quote, it's fascinating because you ought to find sufficient company within yourself, but as proven with Lockwood and even with our own selves, how sufficient is our own company with ourselves when even in our own minds we are thinking of others and meddling in others' situation, or forming our own narratives of others, if that makes sense. To reiterate what I was just saying about how Lockwood is trying to reshape Heathcliff to match his own image because he wants to identify with him and his character. You see it with the line where he says that I stood still and was witness involuntarily to a piece of superstition on the part of my landlord, which belied oddly his apparent sense. He is assuming that Heathcliff would be like him, to be like society, where they believe more in science and things like that, where you have then this stereotype of those of the North and the Moors, more reclusive, small town kind of like secluded areas being more superstitious. It also makes sense of Heathcliff, gypsy heritage, again quoting their description of him being maybe more superstitious. So it makes sense that Heathcliff, having been nurtured and grown up amongst the Moors who might be more superstitious, his own, lineage, and you see it with another part of the story where he talks about curses and stuff like that with Kathy. It would make sense that he would be superstitious, but to Lockwood, he is confused by that because he is trying to see Heathcliff to be identical to himself. I want to talk about the scene where Heathcliff is crying out for Kathy, where in uncontrollable passions of tears, come in, he sobbed, Kathy, do come, oh, do once more, oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time, Catherine, at last. And it continues on where Lockwood then says, there was such anguish in the gush of grief that accompanied this raving that my compassion made me overlook its folly. And I personally believe that this is Emily Bronte kind of looking at the change and views or societal like perceptions or like interaction. I can't think of the word, but their views on romance and like how they like show it, if that makes sense. This is coming off of also Lucy Worsley's A Very British Romance. It's a documentary, it's a book, but during it, she looks at how romance, grew, the evolution of it in Britain at least. And during the Regency time, sensibility was a very big thing. So this is a time of like overly passionate. This is big, passionate words and, gushing and emotions and feelings like that. And you wanted those. And so the Gothic stories that Emily Bronte would have been growing up reading would have had lines like that Heathcliff is saying, big dramatic lines like that. Whereas the time that she is writing in now is the Victorians shifted away from that, becoming more reserved, becoming then idolizing the Arthurian, ideas of knighthood and gentility, of kind of going out and doing great deeds to prove themselves to the ladies and things. So it was less about the written words and more about action. And so it makes sense then also that Lockwood is to kind of embody the Victorian sensibilities of love and romance, which is a little bit more reserved. And that's why he's very confused by Heathcliff's actions, which feels more stereotypical to the previous generations and even the previous generations of stories and the stories that came out of it, such as Gothics that Emily Bronte would have read growing up. And to continue off this, another way to view it and to look at the context of the story itself, the reason why this is awkward for Lockwood is because the small tidbit that we got from him and why he is there is because he feels like he fumbled a romantic pursuit. And I think if I remember incorrectly, because I kind of like have spaced out reading these, he feels like he might have misspoken or said something a little bit too rash. And it's even like a shy sharing that he likes someone. Think middle school, you accidentally say something. It's not this passionate speech that Heathcliff is giving. And so there's polarizing differences on the way that they're communicating that their love. Again, Lockwood is much more reserved, which fits within the sensibility of romance of that time. Being more reserved, you want to show your actions, and then afraid of like saying it out loud. And it could just be his own person that he's afraid of saying it out loud to declare something, whereas Heathcliff is violently and passionately showing all his emotions and declaring it. Also, we have to think of how awkward it is that Heathcliff seems so cold in instances and then so emotional in others, which again goes into the ideas of sensibility of the previous generation of these fits of passion kind of things. Class is also being illustrated by the act of labor. This is something that's going to be illustrated throughout the book, and you're going to see it predominantly with Kathy and Catherine, so the mother and daughter. And I'm bringing it up because here Lockwood enters the kitchen where Zella, the housekeeper, cook, all around servant, is doing work, being berated by Heathcliff. And meanwhile, Catherine is sitting in front of the fireplace reading a book and kind of scolding, kind of reprimanding Zilla whenever, sparks get on her. She's sitting close, and she's in the way of someone that's actually doing labor and she's just reading. And it shows her class because this is something that she's doing, but she's in the way. She's in the kitchen, but she's reading, which is such a luxury and something that you would expect from an upper class who doesn't have to do work, but it doesn't make sense here because this is a house that's not only so secluded, but it doesn't have many servants. So you would expect in a household like this, everyone has to do their part. Think of a Jane Austen story. In most of them, everyone has a job to do. Even in Emma, where she's the richer of all the heroines in Jane Austen stories, has some jobs that she does around the house to help out. Catherine doesn't do anything. Now, in part, it's because her upbringing, she was in a much richer household for most of her life. But the other reason that she does this is it's the only way that she can rebel. The only way that she can push back is to be in the way. And it's such an interesting dynamics being used here. If you think about it, there's more you could probably unpack, and more I will unpack as the story goes on, but I want to point it out here because it caught my attention. To continue off what I had just said, Heathcliff literally says to Catherine, and you worthless, There you are at your idle tricks again. The rest of them do earn their bread. You live on my charity. Put your trash away and find something to do. You shall pay me for the plague of having you eternally in my sight. Do you hear, damnable jade? And for example, I meant to mention this previously. Hareton is working like a servant, like a laborer, even though he technically should have inherited this house. He should have had Heathcliff's position. Yes, he probably still would have been doing some work around the house and the property and the lands that they own, but not to the extent that he does now. And meanwhile, Catherine isn't doing anything. But the reason why I also want to point out this quote is what Heathcliff says: "You shall pay me for the plague of having you eternally in my sight." And again, I'm reading this knowing the full text, and I'm hoping that you guys know the full text. I'm not spoiling anything too much for you, but like that's what makes doing an analysis like this brilliant, is knowing the story, or at least having read it once and then coming back and finding little tidbits of clues and things. And this line to me stands out because it perfectly captures Heathcliff's problem. He does these actions that makes his life more miserable, if that makes sense. Catherine being there playing him wasn't because of her. Like, yes, she had autonomy and chose the decisions that she made later, that we will see later down the book, that caused her to kind of be here. But Heathcliff was the one that first kind of lured her. He is the one that kind of manipulated this young childish mind into this situation, both his own child and her. And Heathcliff is the one that imprisoned her here, keeping her here. And yeah, he is being plagued by this girl who looks just like her mother, supposedly, and being plagued by Catherine. And it's sad, but at the same time, he is doing it to himself, that he has the living embodiment of the woman that he has loved in his, like, physically there, plaguing him because he can't imagine not being able to see her, but simultaneously it's causing him so much pain. Once again, I'll say that the brilliance of this book is that it's showing us so much and leaving a lot unsaid, leaving a lot for the readers to interpret. For example, this line here where Heathcliff lifted his hand and the speaker sprang to a safer distance, obviously acquainted with its weight, and the speaker being Catherine. Having no desire to be entertained by cat and dog combat, I stepped forward briskly, as if eager to partake the warmth of the hearth. And it makes sense that he wouldn't outright call what this is, which is kind of domestic abuse. And being of this time, being of the society and class that he had come from, he wouldn't outright say it. And also, he may not be very acquainted with it. It's something that you would keep behind closed doors, and yet he has a front row seat to this. But this is also a first instant of seeing the toxicity of this household, something that has been seeping through Lockwood's narrative, but not outright told to us, because Lockwood is willfully ignoring it, which is makes sense, and it doesn't simultaneously. But like simultaneously, he doesn't want to view Heathcliff negatively, as I had previously said, because he views an aspect of himself in Heathcliff, and he doesn't want to see an ugliness in himself or compare too closely, if that makes sense. Lockwood saying that his landlord had accompanied him towards his house, or offered to, remind me that again that Heathcliff owns the Grange, I want to say, which we will learn more about later. It was the Linton family estate. And to me, this is pointing out that Heathcliff technically won. He's all his foes are dead and gone. He owns their properties now. He has, clawed his way to their positions, but yet he doesn't have it. Yet he doesn't have the respect, nor does he have any happiness in achieving this, because the manner that he had pursued it was burning the earth to do so. So one of the messaging, one of the themes of the story is about revenge and the manner you go about things, and is it worth it? And I think it's showing that the way that these people pursued their lives wasn't worth it, and that they're like a weed and destroying all the plants around them, going with this quote that comes up later about a weed, strangling the life out of a rose. This will come up much later with Kathy's interaction with the Lintons. And I remember this quote very vaguely because I memorized it for my like senior year AP English class. I was determined to use that quote on the paper, the final paper. But getting back to it, that's what is happening here. That they probably could have found happiness if they had left themselves to grow in the wild, to find happiness in a different manner, but instead that they wanted to move themselves to this particular garden and then suck the life out of it, vampiric style, which also goes with the Gothic style because remember, Gothic has a lot of these similar elements of terror and is looking at humans and human actions, and especially now coming out of the coming into the romantic era of like philosophy and literature, the looking at human actions and human interactions and nature and things like that. So of course they're looking at things like this, but also think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That's a similar kind of themes being pointed there, is looking at humans going too far and their selfish kind of pursuits causing problems. And that's what's being kind of talked about here in a very more domestic environment versus what Frankenstein is. Once again, nature is a very big element of Romanticism era of literature, not always used, but very often. At the end of this chapter, Lockwood is making his journey back with the help of Heathcliff's guide, which is very helpful because while there had previously been like limestone boulders showing the like path, they're now being buried in the snow. And often he thought he was following the right path, but Heathcliff would have to push him more to the right or left because he had wandered off. And Heathcliff knows it like the back of his hand, which makes sense. This is his moors. He knows nature. He is akin to wild nature. It's almost like bringing a wild animal into a home. That is what Heathcliff, I think, is supposed to kind of give us a sense of. But once they had crossed the entrance of Fresh Cross Park, which, by the way, is at not the Grange, uh, he said, I could make no error there, and our dues were limited to a hasty bow. So once they had crossed to the estate of the Linton estate, where the Lintons were the almost the epitome of society, what more would be London society, as we will come to see soon, all of a sudden the path would be clear. It was easier. They have crossed past nature and re-entered society. And it's like that's the symbolism of this, that the moors and Wuthering Heights are wild nature and it's scary and man cannot control it. But once you cross into Fresh Cross Park, it's more akin to man controlling society. So again, this man versus nature being like represented in many different forms and styles, and there's layers to it. And that's what makes the story truly beautiful and fun to pick apart.